In the dense, fog-shrouded forests of Black Creek, Oregon, something evil walked among the towering pines. Between 1998 and 2003, 7 women vanished without a trace, their bodies discovered weeks or months later in remote clearings, arranged in disturbing patterns that suggested a methodical, calculating mind. The killer left no fingerprints, no witnesses, and barely any evidence. For over 2 decades, this case has haunted investigators, tormented families, and terrified an entire community. Tonight, we're diving deep into one of the Pacific Northwest's most chilling, unsolved mysteries. This is the story of the Whispering Woods Killer, a predator who may still be walking free, and the desperate hunt to finally bring them to justice. What you're about to hear will keep you up at night. Let's begin. Before we get into this incredibly disturbing case, if you're fascinated by true crime mysteries and unsolved cases like this one, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss when we uncover another dark chapter in criminal history. Trust me, you'll want to follow along as we explore some of the most perplexing cases that continue to baffle investigators to this day. Now let's talk about Sarah Jenkins and the nightmare that began in the autumn of 1998. Black Creek, Oregon, isn't the kind of place you'd expect to become the hunting ground for a serial killer. Nestled in the Cascade Mountain foothills about 40 miles southeast of Eugene, this timber town of roughly 8,000 residents had always been the embodiment of small-town America. Everyone knew everyone. Kids rode their bikes without supervision. Doors remained unlocked. The biggest crimes the local sheriff's department typically dealt with were bar fights, domestic disputes, and the occasional meth lab discovery in some abandoned logging camp. The town's economy revolved around the timber industry, though by the late 90s, that industry was already in decline, leaving many families struggling and the community's spirit somewhat diminished. Still, Black Creek remained a place where people looked out for each other, where neighbors borrowed sugar and returned lawnmowers, where Friday night high school football games brought out half the town. It was, by all accounts, a safe place to raise a family. The forests surrounding Black Creek were another matter entirely. These weren't the manicured state parks with marked trails and visitor centers. These were working forests, crisscrossed with decades-old logging roads, punctuated by abandoned equipment and forgotten work camps, stretching for hundreds of square miles into wilderness that could swallow a person whole. The terrain was unforgiving, dense with Douglas fir, western hemlock, and cedar trees that blocked out the sun even at midday. Fog rolled in from the Pacific, creating an eerie, disorienting atmosphere where sounds became muffled and distances impossible to judge. Local hunters and loggers knew these woods intimately, but even they admitted there were sections they avoided, places where the forest felt different somehow, where the silence pressed in too heavily. Old-timers told stories about people who'd gone into those woods and never came back, though most chalked such tales up to logging accidents, exposure, or simply people starting over somewhere new. Nobody seriously believed something sinister lurked in those shadows. That innocence ended on October 23, 1998. Sarah Jenkins was 23 years old, a recent graduate from the University of Oregon with a degree in environmental science. She'd returned to her hometown that summer, moving back in with her parents while she searched for work in her field. Like many young people from small towns, Sarah had ambitions beyond Black Creek's borders, but the job market was tough, and she'd taken a temporary position at the town's public library to make ends meet. Those who knew her described Sarah as vivacious, intelligent, and compassionate. She volunteered at the local animal shelter on weekends, coached a girls' soccer team at the community center, and was beloved by patrons at the library who appreciated her enthusiastic book recommendations and willingness to help with even the most tedious research requests. Sarah stood 5'6" with auburn hair that fell past her shoulders, bright green eyes, and a ready smile that put people at ease. She was the kind of person who made everyone around her feel special, who remembered small details about people's lives and followed up with genuine interest. Her parents, Thomas and Margaret Jenkins, were understandably proud of their only daughter. She was their world. October in Western Oregon brings unpredictable weather, and that autumn had been particularly temperamental, oscillating between unseasonably warm days and bone-chilling nights. The 23rd was a Friday, and Sarah had worked her usual shift at the library, leaving around 6 in the evening. She'd made plans to meet her best friend, Emily Castellano, at a local restaurant called the Timber Grill for dinner and drinks at 7:30. Emily had recently gotten engaged, and Sarah was thrilled for her, eager to hear all the wedding planning details and offer her services as maid of honor. Sarah left the library in good spirits, waving goodbye to her supervisor and calling out that she'd see everyone on Monday. Security footage from the library's parking lot, grainy and somewhat difficult to make out, showed Sarah walking to her vehicle, a green 1994 Honda Civic, at approximately 6:04 in the evening. She was alone, moving at a normal pace, showing no signs of distress or awareness of being followed. She got into her car and the vehicle exited the parking lot at 6:06. The Jenkins family lived on Maple Ridge Road, a quiet residential street on the north side of town, about a 12-minute drive from the library. Sarah never made it home. When 7:30 came and went without Sarah appearing at the Timber Grill, Emily wasn't immediately concerned. She and Sarah had been friends since elementary school, and while Sarah was generally punctual, the occasional tardiness wasn't unheard of. Emily ordered a drink and waited, checking her phone periodically. By 8 o'clock, she started to worry. She called Sarah's cell phone multiple times, but each call went straight to voicemail. At 8:15, Emily called the Jenkins house. Margaret answered, and when Emily asked to speak with Sarah, there was a confused pause. Sarah hadn't come home, Margaret said. Wasn't she with Emily? The two women's confusion quickly turned to concern. Margaret immediately called Sarah's cell phone while Thomas checked with neighbors to see if anyone had seen their daughter. Nobody had. At 8:45, Thomas Jenkins called the Black Creek Sheriff's Department to report his daughter missing. Deputy Ryan Holloway took the call. Now here's where the first critical mistakes were made. Mistakes that would haunt this investigation for years to come. In law enforcement, there's often an unofficial waiting period before adults are considered truly missing. The thinking goes that most adults who fail to show up have simply changed plans, gotten distracted, or are exercising their right to go wherever they please without checking in. This logic, while sometimes sound, can be catastrophic in abduction cases where the first few hours are absolutely crucial. Deputy Holloway, a 15-year veteran of the department, listened to Thomas Jenkins's concerns and assured him that Sarah had probably just gone somewhere and forgotten to call. Maybe she'd run into an old friend. Maybe she'd had car trouble and was dealing with it. Maybe a dozen other innocent explanations. Holloway took down the information, said he'd keep an eye out for Sarah's vehicle, and suggested the family call back if she hadn't shown up by morning. Thomas Jenkins, frustrated but uncertain how to push back against law enforcement's assessment, reluctantly agreed to wait. This decision would prove to be a devastating loss of precious time. Sarah's parents didn't sleep that night. Margaret sat by the phone, jumping at every sound, while Thomas drove around town searching for his daughter's green Civic. He checked the library parking lot, the Timber Grill, the animal shelter, the community center, anywhere Sarah might have gone. He found nothing. As dawn broke on October 24th, the Jenkins family called the sheriff's department again, this time more insistent. Their daughter was not the type to disappear without explanation. Something was wrong. This time, Sheriff Dale Morrison himself got involved. Morrison, a heavy-set man in his mid-50s with 30 years of law enforcement experience, had a reputation as a fair, if somewhat old-fashioned lawman. He'd grown up in Black Creek, knew the Jenkins family, and Sarah's disappearance finally triggered his instincts that this was serious. At 7 in the morning on Saturday, October 24th, Sheriff Morrison officially opened a missing persons investigation. The search began in earnest. Deputies fanned out across Black Creek, showing Sarah's photograph to business owners, gas station attendants, anyone who might have seen her Friday evening. They retraced her expected route from the library to her parents' house, looking for any sign of her vehicle or evidence of an accident. Volunteers from the community joined the effort, organizing into search parties to check nearby areas. Emily Castellano provided investigators with a list of Sarah's friends, ex-boyfriends, and acquaintances, anyone who might know where she'd gone. Each lead was followed, each person interviewed, Nobody had seen Sarah after 6 in the evening on Friday. It was as if she'd simply evaporated somewhere between the library and home. On Sunday, October 25th, a resident named Dale Patterson called the sheriff's department with information that would crack the case wide open, though not in any way anyone hoped. Patterson, a retired logger who lived on the outskirts of town, had been walking his property that morning, checking his fence line when he noticed fresh tire tracks leading off County Road 12 into the forest. This wasn't entirely unusual. Hunters and teenagers often used old logging roads to access the woods, but something about these tracks bothered Patterson. They were recent, probably from Friday or Saturday based on how fresh they looked, and they led down an old spur road that hadn't been used in years. More concerning, Patterson could see where vegetation had been disturbed, as if a vehicle had been driven or pushed off the main logging road into deeper cover. His instincts told him something wasn't right. He followed the tracks on foot for about a quarter mile before he saw it, partially concealed by brush and branches, a green Honda Civic. Patterson didn't approach the vehicle. He immediately returned home and called the sheriff's department. Deputies arrived within 30 minutes. The location was approximately 7 miles northeast of town, in a section of forest that saw little traffic. The logging road Patterson had mentioned was overgrown and barely passable, marked on old forestry maps but largely forgotten. As investigators approached the Civic, their worst fears crystallized. The vehicle was Sarah's, confirmed by the license plate. The driver's side door was slightly ajar. The keys were still in the ignition. Sarah's purse sat on the passenger seat, her wallet and cell phone inside, untouched. There was no sign of struggle inside the vehicle, no blood, no evidence of violence. It appeared Sarah had either left the car willingly or been removed before she could resist. Forensic techs processed the scene meticulously, dusting for fingerprints, collecting fiber evidence, searching for any trace of the perpetrator. They found nothing useful. Whoever had done this had been careful. The only prints in and on the vehicle belonged to Sarah and her family members. There were no foreign hairs, no biological evidence, nothing that screamed abduction beyond the obvious fact that Sarah was gone and her car had been deliberately hidden in the woods. The discovery of Sarah's vehicle transformed the investigation. This was no longer a case of a young woman who'd simply disappeared or run away. This was clearly foul play. Sheriff Morrison called in additional resources from the Oregon State Police, including their major crimes unit and forensic specialists. The area surrounding where Sarah's car was found became a massive crime scene, with investigators combing through hundreds of acres of forest. Search and rescue teams, including K-9 units specifically trained to detect human remains, swept through the woods in grid patterns. Helicopters equipped with thermal imaging flew overhead, looking for any heat signature that might indicate Sarah was alive and hidden somewhere in that vast wilderness. Volunteers turned out by the hundreds, forming shoulder-to-shoulder lines to search areas the professionals had already cleared, desperate to find anything that might bring Sarah home. The searches continued for days, then weeks. They found nothing. Sarah Jenkins had vanished completely. The investigation into Sarah's disappearance consumed Black Creek. Investigators interviewed over 300 people in the first 2 weeks alone. They looked at Sarah's ex-boyfriends, though she hadn't been in a serious relationship in over a year. They examined her social connections, wondering if someone had become obsessed with her. They investigated the possibility of a random abduction, though those were statistically rare. Every angle was pursued, every lead followed. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit was consulted, and they provided a preliminary profile of the likely offender. Someone with local knowledge, someone comfortable in the woods, someone organized and methodical. The profile suggested the perpetrator was likely a white male between 25 and 45, possibly with military or law enforcement training based on the careful way he'd hidden the vehicle and left no evidence. He probably lived or worked in the area and had a legitimate reason to be in those forests, which is why no one would find his presence suspicious. The profile was helpful, but without physical evidence or witnesses, it couldn't narrow down suspects significantly. As October turned to November and November to December, hope began to fade. Sarah's parents appeared on local news broadcasts, pleading for information, begging whoever had taken their daughter to let her come home. The community held vigils, prayer services, fundraisers to support the ongoing search efforts. But as the brutal Oregon winter set in, even the most optimistic began to accept the likelihood that Sarah was dead. The question was no longer if they'd find her, but when and in what condition. The answer came on January 17, 1999, nearly 3 months after Sarah vanished. A pair of elk hunters, brothers named Marcus and Tim Wolf, were tracking a bull elk deep in the national forest about 15 miles from where Sarah's car had been discovered. They came upon a small clearing, maybe 30 feet in diameter, ringed by old-growth Douglas firs. In the center of the clearing, partially covered by fallen leaves and decomposing vegetation, they saw something that made their blood run cold. It was a human hand, pale and partially skeletal, emerging from the forest floor. The Wolf brothers immediately contacted authorities, and investigators descended on the site. What they found was nightmare fuel. Sarah Jenkins's body lay in the clearing, positioned on her back with her arms at her sides and her legs straight, almost as if she'd been carefully arranged. She was fully clothed in the same outfit she'd been wearing when she disappeared, the jeans and blue sweater her mother had described. Decomposition was advanced, accelerated by exposure to the elements and scavenger activity. But the medical examiner was able to make several critical determinations. Sarah had died from asphyxiation, likely manual strangulation based on fractures to her hyoid bone and thyroid cartilage. There was no evidence of sexual assault, though the decomposition made absolute certainty impossible. Perhaps most disturbing was the positioning of the body and the location itself. The clearing appeared to have been deliberately chosen. Branches had been arranged in a circular pattern around Sarah's body, not quite touching her but forming a distinct border. Small stones had been placed at cardinal points around the circle: north, south, east, west. It looked almost ritualistic, though investigators were careful not to jump to conclusions about the killer's motivations. What do you think happened to Sarah Jenkins? Do you believe this was a random attack, or was she specifically targeted? Share your thoughts in the comments below, because as we'll see, Sarah's case was just the beginning of something far more sinister. The autopsy provided more questions than answers. Time of death was impossible to determine precisely given the decomposition, but the medical examiner estimated Sarah had died within 24 to 48 hours of her disappearance, meaning sometime between October 23rd and 25th. This timing suggested she'd been held somewhere, at least overnight, before being killed. The careful arrangement of her body indicated the killer had taken his time, had felt safe and unhurried in that remote location. Toxicology results showed no drugs or alcohol in Sarah's system at the time of death, though again, decomposition limited the reliability of these tests. There were no defensive wounds on her hands or arms, suggesting she'd either been restrained or was incapacitated when she was killed. The lack of physical evidence was maddening. Despite processing the scene with extraordinary care, forensic technicians found no fingerprints, no biological evidence beyond Sarah's own, no tire tracks or footprints that could be definitively linked to the killer. Whoever had done this had been incredibly careful, almost professionally so. Sarah's funeral was held on a gray, rainy morning in late January. Nearly 1,000 people attended, filling the First Baptist Church to capacity with overflow crowds, listening to the service from outside. The grief was palpable, crushing. Margaret Jenkins could barely stand, supported by her husband and family members as she said goodbye to her only child. The entire town mourned, but beneath the grief was something else: fear. If this could happen to Sarah Jenkins, a well-liked young woman from a good family, it could happen to anyone. Parents became more protective of their children. Women began traveling in pairs, especially after dark. The carefree innocence that had characterized Black Creek evaporated, replaced by suspicion and anxiety. People looked at their neighbors differently, wondering if the monster who'd killed Sarah was someone they knew, someone they saw every day. Sheriff Morrison vowed that his department wouldn't rest until Sarah's killer was brought to justice. But as winter turned to spring and spring to summer, no arrests were made. The investigation stalled, hampered by lack of evidence and lack of witnesses. Tips came in regularly, but none led anywhere significant. The case began to go cold. Then, on August 14, 1999, barely 7 months after Sarah's body was found, it happened again. This time, the victim was a woman named Rebecca Martinez, and her disappearance would force investigators to confront a terrifying reality: that Black Creek had a serial killer, and he was just getting started. The story of the Whispering Woods killer is far from over. We've only just begun to uncover the dark pattern that emerged in the forests around Black Creek. Rebecca Martinez was 31 years old, a divorced mother of 2 who worked as a nurse at Black Creek Community Hospital. Unlike Sarah Jenkins, who'd grown up in Black Creek with deep family roots in the community, Rebecca was relatively new to town, having moved there just 18 months earlier from Sacramento, California. She'd been searching for a fresh start after a difficult divorce, somewhere quieter and safer to raise her 2 daughters, ages 7 and 9. Black Creek had seemed perfect, the kind of place where kids could have a real childhood, where the schools were decent and the cost of living manageable on a nurse's salary. Rebecca's parents had been concerned about her moving so far away with their granddaughters, but Rebecca had been determined to build a new life. She'd found a modest rental house on the south side of town, enrolled her daughters in the local elementary school, and thrown herself into her work at the hospital. Colleagues describe Rebecca as dedicated, competent, and warm with patients. Exactly the kind of nurse you'd want caring for you or your family. She was petite, standing just 5'2", with dark hair she usually wore pulled back in a practical ponytail, and brown eyes that reflected both kindness and an underlying sadness from the difficulties she'd endured. August 14th, 1999, was a Saturday. Rebecca had worked the night shift at the hospital, 11 in the evening to 7 in the morning, a rotation she often took because it paid slightly better, and her daughters stayed with the trusted babysitter overnight. She clocked out at 7:03, exhausted but looking forward to picking up her girls and spending the day with them. The hospital's parking lot was well lit and had security cameras, and footage from that morning showed Rebecca walking to her vehicle, a white 1997 Toyota Camry, at 7:09. She was alone, carrying her purse and a light jacket. She appeared tired but not distressed, checking her phone as she walked. The footage showed her getting into her car, starting the engine, and pulling out of the parking lot at 7:12. The drive to her babysitter's house should have taken about 8 minutes. Rebecca never arrived. When Rebecca didn't show up by 8 o'clock, the babysitter, a retired school teacher named Dorothy Grimes, became concerned. Dorothy had watched Rebecca's daughters many times and knew Rebecca was reliable, always prompt about picking up her children. She called Rebecca's cell phone repeatedly, but like Sarah Jenkins's phone months earlier, these calls went straight to voicemail. By 8:30, Dorothy called the hospital to see if Rebecca had been held over for some emergency. The charge nurse checked and confirmed Rebecca had clocked out over an hour ago. Dorothy then made the decision to call the Black Creek Sheriff's Department, and when she explained the situation, mentioning that another young woman had disappeared under similar circumstances less than a year ago, the deputy who answered immediately escalated the call. Within minutes, Sheriff Morrison was notified, and unlike with Sarah Jenkins, there was no hesitation, no suggestion to wait and see if Rebecca turned up. Every deputy on duty was mobilized. This was treated as an emergency from minute one. The search for Rebecca Martinez began immediately, but it followed a grimly familiar pattern. Her vehicle was discovered around noon that same day, this time by a utility worker who'd been checking power lines along Old Mill Road, about 9 miles east of Black Creek. The white Camry had been driven down another abandoned logging road, this one even more overgrown than where Sarah's car had been found, and partially concealed with branches and brush. Once again, the keys were in the ignition, the driver's door slightly open, Rebecca's purse on the passenger seat with her wallet and phone untouched. Once again, there were no signs of struggle inside the vehicle, no blood, no evidence of violence. Once again, forensic examination yielded nothing useful, no fingerprints except Rebecca's, no biological evidence, no witnesses. It was Sarah Jenkins all over again, and that terrified everyone involved in the investigation. The FBI was brought in immediately this time. no longer as consultants but as full partners in the investigation. The presence of two similar abductions in the same small town within 7 months, both involving women taken en route to their destinations, both involving vehicles deliberately hidden in remote forest locations, indicated a serial offender with a clear methodology. Special Agent Catherine Reeves, a veteran investigator with the FBI's Violent Criminal Apprehension Program, arrived in Black Creek within 24 hours of Rebecca's disappearance. Reeves was a sharp, no-nonsense professional who'd worked dozens of serial cases throughout her career, and she immediately recognized the hallmarks of an organized, intelligent offender. The careful concealment of the vehicles, the lack of physical evidence, the selection of victims who could be taken without witnesses, all pointed to someone who planned meticulously and executed flawlessly. Reeves assembled a task force combining FBI agents, Oregon State Police detectives, and local sheriff's deputies, establishing a command center at the Black Creek Sheriff's Department. Every resource available was poured into finding Rebecca Martinez before she met the same fate as Sarah Jenkins. The massive search operation that followed dwarfed the efforts made for Sarah. Hundreds of law enforcement personnel and volunteers combed through thousands of acres of forest. Helicopters with thermal imaging and ground-penetrating radar units swept the wilderness. K-9 teams from across the Pacific Northwest converged on Black Creek. Roadblocks were established on every road leading out of the area, with officers checking vehicles and questioning drivers. The media descended on the town, transforming the quiet logging community into the epicenter of a national news story. Nancy Grace covered the case on her show. America's Most Wanted devoted a segment to it. The attention was intense and unrelenting. For 2 weeks, the search continued around the clock. Investigators were certain Rebecca was somewhere in those vast forests, that the killer had followed his previous pattern. They just had to find her before it was too late, though in their hearts, most already knew they were searching for a body, not a survivor. Rebecca's daughters stayed with Dorothy Grimes, shielded as much as possible from the media circus and the terrible reality that their mother had likely been murdered. Rebecca's parents flew in from California, devastated and desperate for answers. Her ex-husband was immediately investigated and cleared. He'd been in Sacramento the entire time with a rock-solid alibi. The focus remained on finding Rebecca and identifying her abductor. Agent Reeves pushed her team hard, reviewing every piece of evidence from Sarah Jenkins's case, looking for any connection between the two victims. On the surface, Sarah and Rebecca didn't have much in common. Sarah had been 23, white, single, raised in Black Creek, worked at the library. Rebecca was 31, Hispanic, divorced with children, new to town, worked at the hospital. Their social circles didn't overlap. They'd never worked together or attended the same church or shared obvious connections. But Reeves knew that serial killers often selected victims based on opportunity and personal preference rather than specific relationships. Both women were attractive, both were alone when taken. Both were taken in the early morning hours on quiet roads with limited traffic. The killer was selecting targets of opportunity, women he could abduct without being seen. 2 weeks after Rebecca's disappearance, on August 29th, the worst fears were confirmed. A group of forestry students from Oregon State University were conducting a field survey in a remote section of the Umpqua National Forest, approximately 22 miles from Black Creek. They were documenting tree species and measuring crown density when they entered a clearing that looked disturbingly familiar from news reports about Sarah Jenkins's case. This clearing was slightly larger, maybe 40 feet across, ringed by towering pines and cedars. And in the center, carefully arranged on the forest floor, was Rebecca Martinez's body. The students immediately backed away and called authorities. By afternoon, the site was swarming with investigators, forensic technicians, and FBI agents. What they found confirmed this was the same killer, and that he was following a specific ritual. Rebecca's body lay on her back, arms at her sides, legs straight, just like Sarah. She was fully clothed in her nurse's scrubs, the same outfit she'd been wearing when she disappeared. Decomposition was less advanced than Sarah's had been, allowing the medical examiner to make more definitive determinations. Rebecca had died from asphyxiation, Manual strangulation, identical to Sarah. There was no evidence of sexual assault. Time of death was estimated at within 48 hours of her abduction, suggesting she'd been held somewhere briefly before being killed. And surrounding her body was that same disturbing arrangement. Branches laid in a circular pattern around the corpse, stones placed at cardinal points. This time, investigators noticed additional details. Small wildflowers had been placed near Rebecca's head, species native to the area, arranged almost reverently. It was clear the killer spent significant time with his victims after death, staging these elaborate scenes. The question that haunted everyone was, why? What was the significance of these arrangements? Was it religious, occult, or simply the personal ritual of a deeply disturbed mind? The forensic examination of Rebecca's crime scene was even more thorough than Sarah's had been, but the results were frustratingly similar. No usable physical evidence, no fingerprints, no biological material beyond the victim's own. The killer had once again been extraordinarily careful. Investigators did find one potentially significant detail: faint impressions in the soil near the clearing's edge that might have been partial boot prints. They were photographed and cast, but they were too incomplete to be definitively matched to any specific footwear. Still, it was something, a tiny crack in the killer's otherwise perfect execution. The boot prints suggested a men's size 10 or 11, which didn't narrow down suspects much, but added to the developing profile. Agent Reeves updated the FBI's assessment, now with 2 confirmed victims to analyze. The offender was almost certainly a white male, probably in his 30s or 40s, physically fit enough to overpower and transport victims, intelligent and organized, with detailed knowledge of the local forests. He likely had a job or lifestyle that gave him flexibility to stalk victims and access to the remote areas where he left the bodies. He was comfortable in wilderness settings, possibly had hunting or camping experience, maybe had worked in forestry or logging. He lived in or very near Black Creek, close enough to observe potential victims and know their routines. Think about this for a moment. 2 women, both taken from their vehicles in the early morning hours, both strangled and left in remote forest clearings with bizarre ritualistic elements. What drives someone to not just kill, but to stage their victims this way? Drop your theories in the comments. I'd love to hear what you think was going through this killer's mind. The revelation that Black Creek had a serial killer sent shockwaves through the community and beyond. This wasn't just a local tragedy anymore. This was a national story about a predator hunting women in a small Oregon town. The media coverage became overwhelming, with reporters camped out in Black Creek, interviewing anyone willing to talk, broadcasting live from outside the sheriff's department. The town's residents were terrified. Women changed their routines dramatically, many refusing to drive alone or go out after dark. Gun sales spiked. Home security systems that had never been necessary in Black Creek suddenly became bestsellers. Parents kept their children under constant supervision. The town that had once felt so safe now felt like a hunting ground, and everyone was potential prey. The psychological impact was profound and lasting. People stopped trusting their neighbors. Anonymous tips flooded into the sheriff's department, with residents reporting anything suspicious: a neighbor who kept odd hours, a co-worker who seemed too interested in the case, a stranger seen near the forest roads. Every tip had to be investigated, overwhelming the task force's resources. Sheriff Morrison held regular press conferences, trying to balance keeping the public informed with not revealing details that might compromise the investigation. He assured residents that every possible resource was being devoted to catching the killer, that the FBI's best minds were working the case, that justice would be served. But privately, Morrison was struggling. The pressure was immense, coming from town residents, from the victims' families, from the media, from state officials. And despite all the manpower and expertise thrown at this case, they seemed no closer to identifying the killer than they'd been after Sarah's murder. The lack of physical evidence was crippling the investigation. Without DNA, without fingerprints, without witnesses, how were they supposed to catch this guy? They were reduced to hoping he'd make a mistake, leave something behind, or that someone would recognize something in the behavioral profile and come forward. It felt reactive, inadequate, desperate. Agent Reeves pushed for more proactive measures. She recommended releasing more information to the public, including some details about the ritualistic staging of the bodies, hoping someone might recognize the symbolism or know someone obsessed with similar imagery. Morrison was hesitant, worried about copycats or causing more panic, but eventually agreed to release some carefully chosen details. The public learned about the circular branch arrangements and the stones at cardinal points, described in press releases as the killer's signature. Reeves also pushed for extensive interviews with anyone connected to outdoor recreation, forestry work, or hunting in the area. Lists were compiled of hundreds of men who fit the general profile, and teams of investigators began the tedious work of interviewing them, checking alibis, looking for anything suspicious. It was needle in a haystack work, exhausting and mostly fruitless, but it had to be done. Months passed without another abduction, and a strange kind of tentative hope emerged. Maybe the killer had stopped. Maybe he'd moved on to another area or had died or been incarcerated for some unrelated crime. The task force remained active, continuing to pursue leads and review evidence, but the urgency slowly diminished. Life in Black Creek gradually returned to something resembling normalcy, though the scars remained. Rebecca's daughters were moved to California to live with their grandparents, spared from growing up in the town where their mother was murdered. Sarah's parents became advocates for missing persons cases, channeling their grief into helping other families navigate similar nightmares. The one-year anniversaries of both murders brought renewed media attention, with retrospective pieces wondering if the Whispering Woods killer would strike again, or if his brief reign of terror had somehow ended. Those questions were answered definitively on March 12, 2000, when the third victim disappeared. Jennifer Hartley was 27 years old, a school teacher at Black Creek Elementary School who taught third grade and was adored by her students and their parents. Jennifer had grown up in a small town in eastern Oregon and had moved to Black Creek 3 years earlier for the teaching position. She was engaged to her college sweetheart, Michael Preston, with a wedding planned for June. Jennifer was the embodiment of wholesomeness and optimism, the kind of person who saw the best in everyone and approached life with infectious enthusiasm. She was 5'7" with blonde hair usually worn in a neat bun, blue eyes, and a warm smile that made children feel safe. She lived in a small apartment on Birch Street, just a few blocks from the school, and was known for walking to work most days, enjoying the fresh air and exercise. On the evening of March 11th, Jennifer had stayed late at school, preparing materials for the next week and decorating her classroom for an upcoming spring party. Several colleagues saw her leave around 6:30, waving goodbye as she headed to her car in the school's parking lot. That was the last time anyone saw Jennifer Hartley alive. When Jennifer didn't show up for brunch on Sunday, March 12th, her fiancé Michael became concerned. They'd made plans to meet at 11 at their favorite cafe, and Jennifer was compulsive about keeping commitments. Michael called her apartment repeatedly but got no answer. He drove to her building and knocked on her door. Nothing. Using a spare key Jennifer had given him, Michael entered the apartment and found it empty, but Jennifer's cat hadn't been fed and there was spoiled food on the counter, as if Jennifer had been in the middle of putting groceries away when something interrupted her. Michael's concern turned to terror when he remembered the other women who'd disappeared from Black Creek. He immediately called the sheriff's department, and once again, given the circumstances and the history, the response was immediate and massive. Jennifer's vehicle, a blue 2000 Honda CR-V she'd purchased just 2 months earlier, was found within hours. A deputy spotted it on Forest Service Road 14, about 12 miles northwest of town, parked down yet another abandoned logging spur. The scene was nightmarishly familiar. Keys in the ignition, driver's door ajar, purse untouched. No signs of struggle, no useful evidence. But there was one new detail that sent chills through the investigators. Inside Jennifer's vehicle, placed carefully on the driver's seat, was a small bouquet of wildflowers, the same species that had been found near Rebecca Martinez's body. This was the first time the killer had left something deliberate in the vehicle, almost like he was taunting the investigation, saying, "Yes, it's me again, and there's nothing you can do about it." The wildflowers were processed for evidence, but predictably they yielded nothing. No fingerprints, no biological evidence. Just flowers that could have been picked anywhere in the surrounding forests by anyone with basic knowledge of local flora. The task force, which had been operating at reduced capacity, was immediately reactivated at full strength. Agent Reeves returned to Black Creek, bringing additional FBI resources including profilers, forensic specialists, and analysts. The realization that the killer was still active, still hunting, sent the community into a state of near panic. School attendance dropped as parents kept children home. Businesses saw revenue plummet as people avoided going out. The town that had been slowly healing was ripped open again, the wounds deeper and more painful than before. The search for Jennifer followed the now established pattern: massive deployment of personnel and resources, systematic searches of the forests, desperate hope that somehow they'd find her alive. But everyone knew how this would end. The only questions were when and where they'd find her body, and whether the killer had left any clues this time. The answer came on April 3rd, 22 days after Jennifer disappeared. A pair of mountain bikers exploring trails in a remote section of the Willamette National Forest discovered a clearing that fit the description they'd heard in news reports. In the center lay Jennifer Hartley's body, arranged exactly like the previous victims, on her back, arms at sides, legs straight, surrounded by the circular pattern of branches and stones at cardinal points. The wildflowers near her head had wilted but were still recognizable. Jennifer was wearing the same clothes she'd disappeared in, a floral dress and cardigan. The medical examiner's findings were consistent with the previous murders: death by asphyxiation, manual strangulation, held for a brief period before being killed, no evidence of sexual assault. The time of death was estimated at within 72 hours of her abduction, suggesting the killer had kept Jennifer alive longer than his previous victims, though what happened during that time remained a horrifying mystery. 3 victims in less than 2 years. 3 women dead, their bodies left in ritualistic displays in the deep forest. The Whispering Woods Killer had established himself as one of the most prolific and elusive serial killers in the Pacific Northwest. And despite the massive investigation, despite the FBI's involvement, despite all the resources and expertise brought to bear, law enforcement seemed no closer to catching him than they'd been after the first murder. In fact, as we'll see in the next part of this story, the investigation was about to take several wrong turns that would allow the killer to continue his reign of terror unchecked, and would ultimately result in 4 more women losing their lives. The question that haunted everyone was simple but terrifying: who would be next? In the wake of Jennifer Hartley's murder, the investigation into the Whispering Woods Killer entered what would later be recognized as its most critical and problematic phase. With 3 confirmed victims and mounting public pressure to make an arrest, the task force found itself torn between methodical detective work and the desperate need to show progress. This tension would lead to a series of investigative missteps that not only failed to catch the killer but may have actually allowed him to claim more victims. Understanding how and why these mistakes happened provides crucial insight into both the challenges of hunting serial killers and the very human tendency to see patterns where we want them to exist, rather than where they actually are. The expanded task force now included over 40 investigators from multiple agencies: the Black Creek Sheriff's Department, Oregon State Police, FBI, and even U.S. Forest Service law enforcement officers who had intimate knowledge of the wilderness areas where bodies were being dumped. Agent Catherine Reeves remained the de facto leader, coordinating efforts and maintaining the investigative database that tracked every piece of evidence, every witness statement, every potential lead. The sheer volume of information was staggering. Thousands of tips had come in through the hotline established after Sarah Jenkins's murder, each requiring evaluation and follow-up. Hundreds of individuals had been interviewed, many multiple times. Dozens of potential suspects had been identified based on the behavioral profile, investigated, and cleared. The forensic evidence, or rather the lack thereof, remained maddeningly consistent across all 3 crime scenes. This killer was careful to the point of obsession, leaving nothing behind that could identify him. Sheriff Morrison, feeling the weight of 3 unsolved murders and an increasingly hostile public, became fixated on the idea that the killer must be someone within the community, someone familiar enough with law enforcement procedures to avoid leaving evidence, someone who could move through Black Creek without arousing suspicion. This line of thinking led the investigation in a direction that would consume enormous resources while ultimately proving fruitless. Morrison theorized that the killer might be someone in a position of trust or authority, possibly even someone connected to law enforcement or emergency services. After all, the victims had all been taken without apparent struggle or alarm, suggesting they might have trusted their abductor, at least initially. This theory gained traction within the task force, despite Agent Reeves's concerns that they were narrowing their focus prematurely without solid evidence supporting this particular hypothesis. By late spring of 2000, the investigation had essentially split into two competing directions. One faction, led primarily by Sheriff Morrison and several Oregon State Police detectives, pursued the insider threat theory, focusing intensively on anyone connected to law enforcement, fire departments, emergency medical services, or similar positions of authority. The other faction, championed by Agent Reeves and several FBI analysts, maintained a broader view, continuing to examine anyone who fit the general profile regardless of their occupation. This division created inefficiencies and occasional conflicts within the task force, with different teams pursuing different suspects and sometimes working at cross purposes. The strain showed in press conferences, where Morrison's assurances that they were closing in on the killer rang increasingly hollow as weeks turned to months without an arrest. The insider threat theory led investigators to a man named Richard Kohler, and for a time, it seemed they might have found their killer. Kohler was a 42-year-old volunteer firefighter and part-time EMT who lived on the outskirts of Black Creek. He was divorced, lived alone, and had a reputation as something of a loner, though he was generally well regarded for his service to the community. What drew attention to Kohler was a series of coincidences that, taken together, seemed damning. He'd been on duty or on call during the time frames when both Sarah Jenkins and Rebecca Martinez disappeared. He was an avid outdoorsman who spent considerable time in the forests surrounding Black Creek, hunting, fishing, and hiking. He drove a pickup truck with off-road capabilities, perfect for navigating abandoned logging roads. Most concerning, a check of his background revealed that 15 years earlier, while living in Montana, Kohler had been investigated in connection with a woman's disappearance, though he'd never been charged and the case remained unsolved. When investigators learned about this previous investigation, it seemed like too much to be coincidental. In June 2000, Richard Kohler became the primary focus of the investigation. Teams of investigators dug into every aspect of his life, interviewing ex-wives, family members, friends, and acquaintances. They obtained warrants to search his property, his vehicle, and his financial records. They placed him under surveillance, documenting his movements and activities. They analyzed phone records, looking for any connection to the victims or their last known locations. The community, desperate for resolution, learned through media leaks that investigators were focusing on a specific. In June 2000, Richard Kohler became the primary focus of the investigation. Teams of investigators dug into every aspect of his life, interviewing ex-wives, family members, friends, and acquaintances. They obtained warrants to search his property, his vehicle, and his financial records. They placed him under surveillance, documenting his movements and activities. They analyzed phone records, looking for any connection to the victims or their last known locations. Suspect, and Kohler's name inevitably became public. His life was turned upside down. People who'd known him for years suddenly looked at him with suspicion and fear. His volunteer positions were suspended pending the investigation's outcome, and he found himself essentially convicted in the court of public opinion despite never being formally charged with anything. The problem was that despite months of intensive investigation, no actual evidence linked Richard Kohler to any of the murders. Yes, he fit the general profile, but so did hundreds of other men in the area. Yes, he'd been investigated in Montana years earlier, but that investigation had concluded without charges because there was no evidence of his involvement. His truck, thoroughly processed by forensic technicians, contained no traces of any of the victims. His property, searched multiple times, revealed nothing suspicious. His alibis, while not ironclad, were adequate for at least 2 of the disappearances. Phone records showed no calls to the victims or surveillance of their movements. Financial records showed no unusual purchases or activities. DNA samples voluntarily provided by Kohler didn't match any biological evidence from any of the crime scenes. Though given the lack of such evidence, this was hardly surprising. By autumn of 2000, even the strongest proponents of Kohler's guilt had to acknowledge they had nothing concrete to charge him with. What do you think about investigations that focus too heavily on one suspect? Have you ever seen a case where tunnel vision led police in the wrong direction? Let me know in the comments, because this mistake would have tragic consequences. The Kohler investigation represented a massive expenditure of time and resources that ultimately led nowhere, but the damage went beyond wasted effort. While investigators were fixated on proving Kohler's guilt, the actual killer remained free and active. On October 7, 2000, exactly 6 months after Jennifer Hartley's body was discovered, the Whispering Woods killer struck again. The fourth victim was Michelle Porter, a 34-year-old real estate agent who'd moved to Black Creek just 8 months earlier, seeing opportunity in a depressed housing market where she could make a name for herself. Michelle was married with a teenage son from a previous relationship, and by all accounts, she was thriving professionally and personally. She'd grown up in Portland, was comfortable with city life, but appreciated the slower pace and natural beauty of Black Creek. Michelle was energetic, outgoing, and successful, exactly the kind of person who brought positive energy wherever she went. On the evening of October 6th, Michelle had shown a property to potential buyers, a vacant house on the north end of town that had been on the market for over a year. The showing ended around 7:30, and Michelle's clients, a young couple, later told investigators that Michelle had seemed fine, professional and friendly as always. They parted ways in the driveway, the couple heading home while Michelle remained behind to lock up the property and place her sign in the yard. Security footage from a neighbor's home camera, positioned to monitor their own driveway, inadvertently captured Michelle's silver Lexus sedan leaving the property at 7:47. It was the last confirmed sighting of her alive. When Michelle didn't return home by 10 o'clock, her husband David became concerned. Michelle often worked late, but she was good about calling if she'd be past 9. When repeated calls to her cell went to voicemail, David's concern escalated to alarm. He drove to the property Michelle had been showing, found it locked up but no sign of his wife or her vehicle, and immediately called the sheriff's department. The response was instantaneous and overwhelming. Every available deputy rolled out, helicopters were scrambled, roadblocks established. Michelle's vehicle was located within 2 hours, found on Forest Service Road 21, approximately 18 miles east of Black Creek, driven down yet another abandoned logging road and partially concealed. The scene was identical to the previous abductions: keys in ignition, door ajar, purse untouched, no signs of struggle, no useful evidence. This time, however, the killer had left another calling card, a bouquet of wildflowers placed on the driver's seat, just like he'd done with Jennifer Hartley's car. It was as if he were establishing a pattern within a pattern, marking his later victims with this floral signature. The message was clear and chilling: I'm still here, I'm still hunting, and you still can't catch me. The discovery of Michelle's abandoned vehicle, while the intensive investigation of Richard Kohler was still ongoing, dealt a devastating blow to that theory. Kohler had been under nearly constant surveillance for weeks, and investigators knew with certainty that he couldn't have abducted Michelle Porter. He'd been at the fire station on October 6th, surrounded by witnesses, during the entire time frame when Michelle disappeared. There was simply no way he could have been involved. This forced the task force to confront an uncomfortable reality. They'd spent months pursuing the wrong man, while the actual killer continued operating freely. The realization was crushing for investigators and catastrophic for the investigation's credibility. The public's faith in law enforcement's ability to catch the killer, already shaky, evaporated completely. Media coverage became openly critical, questioning the competence of the investigation and wondering how many more women would die before an arrest was made. Sheriff Morrison held a press conference on October 9th, 2 days after Michelle's disappearance, and it was clear the strain had taken its toll. Morrison, who'd always projected confidence and control, looked haggard and defeated. He acknowledged that the investigation had pursued leads that hadn't panned out. carefully avoiding naming Kohler but making clear that their primary suspect had been cleared. He assured the public that the investigation was refocusing and that every resource would be devoted to finding Michelle Porter and catching her abductor. But the assurances rang hollow. 4 women had disappeared, 3 confirmed dead, and the 4th almost certainly so, and law enforcement seemed no closer to solving these crimes than they'd been 2 years earlier. The press conference became contentious, with reporters asking pointed questions about investigative mistakes and whether Morrison should step down. The sheriff refused to resign, insisting he owed it to the victims and their families to see this through, but it was clear his authority and credibility had been severely damaged. Agent Reeves attempted to redirect the investigation back to solid investigative principles rather than speculative theories. She ordered a complete review of all evidence from all 4 cases, looking for any connections or patterns that might have been missed. She brought in additional FBI profilers to update and refine the behavioral assessment of the killer. She pushed for more public engagement, encouraging anyone with information, no matter how insignificant it might seem, to come forward. The task force also reached out to other law enforcement agencies across the Pacific Northwest, checking for similar unsolved cases that might be connected to the same offender. This yielded some interesting possibilities. Several unsolved murders in Northern California and Southern Washington shared some characteristics with the Black Creek cases, though none were identical enough to definitively link them to the same killer. Still, it suggested the possibility that the Whispering Woods killer might have been active longer and across a wider geographic area than initially believed. The search for Michelle Porter followed the grim routine that had become all too familiar. Massive searches of the forests, K-9 units, helicopters, volunteers by the hundreds combing through the wilderness. Michelle's husband David and their 15-year-old son appeared on news programs pleading for information, their pain raw and devastating to witness. The real estate community rallied around the family, offering support and organizing vigils. But as days turned to weeks, hope faded. On November 2nd, 26 days after Michelle disappeared, hunters found her body in a clearing approximately 30 miles from Black Creek, the farthest any victim had been taken. The scene was identical to the previous 3, body arranged carefully on its back, circular pattern of branches, stones at cardinal points, wilted wildflowers near the head. The medical examiner confirmed death by asphyxiation, manual strangulation, held for a brief period before death, no evidence of sexual assault. Michelle Porter became the 4th confirmed victim of the Whispering Woods killer, and the community's terror reached new heights. By the end of 2000, Black Creek had fundamentally changed. The town that had once been defined by its sense of community and safety was now synonymous with fear and death. Property values plummeted as families moved away, seeking fresh starts in places untainted by serial murder. Businesses closed, unable to survive the economic downturn caused by the tourism collapse and the exodus of residents. The schools saw enrollment drop significantly. Those who remained lived in a state of hypervigilance, constantly looking over their shoulders, suspicious of everyone, afraid to let their guard down even for a moment. Women traveled in groups or not at all. Gun ownership became nearly universal. The psychological scars on the community were deep and would last for generations. Parents who'd grown up in Black Creek during this period would pass their trauma and fear onto their children, creating a lasting legacy of anxiety and mistrust. The investigation itself became a study in frustration and desperation. With Richard Kohler cleared and no other strong suspects emerging, investigators were back to square one, sorting through thousands of tips and hundreds of potential suspects with no clear direction. Agent Reeves pushed for a return to basics, focusing on geographic profiling to try to narrow down where the killer might live or work, based on the locations of abductions and body dump sites. This analysis suggested the killer likely lived somewhere in a triangle formed by Black Creek, Eugene, and Roseburg, with Black Creek at the center. This was a huge area, encompassing hundreds of square miles and tens of thousands of potential suspects. Cross-referencing this geographic profile with the behavioral profile, investigators developed a list of over 300 men who warranted further investigation. Teams began the tedious process of interviewing and investigating each one, checking alibis, examining backgrounds, looking for anything that might elevate someone from person of interest to actual suspect. It was exhausting, grinding work with little to show for it. The media scrutiny remained intense and often hostile. National news magazines and television programs descended on Black Creek, producing features about the investigation's failures and the community's trauma. Dateline NBC aired a special episode titled "Terror in the Timber: The Hunt for the Whispering Woods Killer" that was highly critical of the investigation's handling, particularly the months spent pursuing Richard Kohler while the real killer remained free. 48 Hours did a similar piece, interviewing victims' families and community members who expressed frustration and anger at law enforcement's inability to protect them. Sheriff Morrison became a target of particular criticism, with calls for his resignation intensifying. He survived a recall effort in early 2001, but barely, and it was clear his political career was over regardless of whether the case was ever solved. The pressure on everyone involved in the investigation was enormous, affecting mental health, families, and professional relationships. As 2001 progressed, a strange and temporary reprieve occurred. Months passed without another abduction. By summer, nearly a year had elapsed since Michelle Porter's disappearance, raising cautious hope that maybe, somehow, the killing had stopped. The theories about why varied wildly. Maybe the killer had died or been imprisoned for an unrelated crime. Maybe the intense investigation and media attention had scared him into stopping. Maybe he'd moved to another area. Maybe he'd satisfied whatever dark compulsion drove him and no longer felt the need to kill. Investigators knew better than to assume the case was over. Serial killers often went through periods of inactivity for various reasons, but the temporary halt in killings at least allowed the task force to catch its breath and regroup. The community remained fearful but began to function more normally. People cautiously resuming routines they'd abandoned, businesses slowly recovering, life moving forward even as the wounds remained raw. This period of relative calm allowed investigators to pursue more analytical approaches to the case. FBI behavioral analysts produced an updated and more detailed profile of the killer, incorporating insights from all 4 murders, plus the geographic and temporal patterns. The profile suggested a white male in his 30s to mid-40s, of above-average intelligence, likely employed in a job that provided flexibility and wouldn't be missed if he took time off for stalking and killing. He probably appeared normal and trustworthy in social situations, someone who could approach women without immediately triggering alarm. He had extensive knowledge of the forests around Black Creek, suggesting either professional involvement in forestry, logging, or outdoor recreation, or simply a lifelong familiarity with the area born of growing up there. He likely lived alone or had living arrangements that allowed him privacy to plan and recover from his crimes without scrutiny. The ritualistic staging of victims suggested he was acting out some personal fantasy or fulfilling some psychological need, though exactly what that need might be remained unclear. The profile also addressed the question of why the killer chose his particular victims. Despite initial assumptions that he was targeting specific types of women, detailed analysis revealed that the victims were actually quite diverse in age, appearance, background, and lifestyle. What they shared was opportunity. They were alone, in isolated or semi-isolated locations, during time frames when the killer could act without being observed. This suggested an opportunistic rather than preferential selection process. The killer was likely constantly on the lookout for potential victims, watching and waiting for the right circumstances. When those circumstances aligned, when a woman was vulnerable and the risk of detection was low, he struck. This made him particularly dangerous because it meant virtually any woman could become a target if she happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. But just as the community began to believe the nightmare might be over, just as investigators dared to hope that maybe they'd caught a break, the killer returned with a vengeance. And what happened next would prove beyond any doubt that this was no ordinary predator, but someone driven by compulsions so powerful that nothing, not even the most intensive manhunt in Oregon history, could stop him from killing again. The silence that followed Michelle Porter's murder stretched through most of 2001, creating an eerie calm that felt more ominous than reassuring. Investigators continued their work, following leads that went nowhere, interviewing suspects who were ultimately cleared, and reviewing evidence that refused to yield new insights. The task force remained active but operated at reduced capacity as resources were gradually redirected to other cases. Agent Catherine Reeves returned to FBI headquarters in Virginia, though she maintained regular contact with the investigation and insisted on being notified immediately if there were any developments. Sheriff Morrison, politically weakened but still in office, threw himself into the case with an almost obsessive determination, as if solving it might somehow redeem his tarnished reputation. The community existed in a state of anxious vigilance, never quite believing the nightmare was over but desperately wanting to move forward with normal life. Then, on February 14, 2002, Valentine's Day, the killer shattered any illusions that he was gone. The fifth victim was Amanda Chen, a 29-year-old graphic designer who worked remotely from her home in Black Creek, creating marketing materials for clients across the country. Amanda had moved to the area from San Francisco 18 months earlier, seeking a quieter lifestyle where she could focus on her work and enjoy outdoor activities. She was an accomplished rock climber and mountain biker, frequently exploring the trails and wilderness areas around Black Creek. Friends described her as adventurous, independent, and fearless, qualities that may have ultimately made her vulnerable to the predator hunting in those forests. Amanda was single, living alone in a small house she rented on the eastern edge of town, and her lifestyle meant she often kept irregular hours, working late into the night or heading out for dawn climbing sessions when the lighting was perfect. On the morning of February 14th, Amanda posted on an online climbing forum that she was heading to Scouts Point, a popular rock climbing area about 15 miles from Black Creek, to work on a difficult route she'd been attempting for weeks. She mentioned she was going alone because her usual climbing partners weren't available, and that she expected to be back by early afternoon. This post, time-stamped at 6:42 in the morning, would be Amanda's last communication with anyone. When she didn't respond to messages later that day and didn't show up for a virtual meeting with a client scheduled for 3 in the afternoon, her friends became concerned. One of them called the Black Creek Sheriff's Department around 5 that evening, explaining that Amanda was missing and that she'd said she was going climbing alone. Given the history of disappearances in the area, deputies were dispatched immediately to Scouts Point. They found Amanda's vehicle, a blue Subaru Outback, in the parking area at the trailhead. The car was locked and there was no sign of disturbance. Inside, investigators found Amanda's climbing gear, carefully organized in the back, her laptop bag on the passenger seat, and her purse tucked under the driver's seat. This scene was different from the previous abductions. Amanda hadn't been taken from her vehicle on a remote road. She'd apparently been abducted from the climbing area itself, in broad daylight, from a location that, while not heavily trafficked in February, was still a public recreation area where other people might appear at any time. This represented a significant escalation in the killer's boldness and risk-taking. The immediate question was whether this was even the same offender, or if Amanda's disappearance was unrelated to the previous cases. The task force was immediately reconvened at full strength. Agent Reeves flew back to Oregon within hours of learning about Amanda's disappearance. The search effort was massive and immediate, focusing first on Scouts Point and the surrounding wilderness. Search and rescue teams combed every trail, every rock face, every clearing within a 5-mile radius. Helicopters with thermal imaging swept the area. Canine units tracked scent trails, volunteers organized by the hundreds, desperate to find Amanda before she suffered the same fate as the previous victims. The search continued for days, then weeks, but found nothing. Amanda Chen had vanished as completely as the women before her, swallowed by the vast forests that had become synonymous with death and terror. During the search, investigators made a discovery that confirmed this was indeed the work of the Whispering Woods killer. On a tree near the main climbing trail, carved into the bark with a sharp instrument, was a symbol, a circle with lines radiating outward like a primitive sun or compass rose. It was crude but deliberate, and it hadn't been there when the area was checked 2 days earlier during a routine patrol. More disturbing, at the base of the tree, partially concealed by fallen leaves, was a small bouquet of wildflowers, now wilted, the same species the killer had left with his previous victims. This was his signature, his way of claiming credit for Amanda's abduction. The carving was photographed and measured, and toolmark experts analyzed it, determining it had been made with a fixed blade knife with a blade approximately 4 to 5 inches long. The carving was fresh, made within the previous 48 hours. It was both a taunt and a confirmation that the Whispering Woods killer was back, and he was growing bolder. The realization that the killer had struck again after such a long dormant period sent shockwaves through the investigation and the community. The nearly year-long gap between Michelle Porter's murder and Amanda Chen's disappearance raised new questions about the killer's psychology and motivations. Agent Reeves and her team of behavioral analysts spent hours discussing what this cooling-off period might mean. Some serial killers experience long gaps between murders because their urge to kill is triggered by specific stressors in their lives. Once the stressor passes, the compulsion fades until something triggers it again. Others simply exercise restraint, fighting their urges for periods of time before the pressure becomes too great and they must kill again. The fact that this killer had apparently gone over a year without killing suggested he might have significant self-control, making him even more dangerous because it meant he was rational enough to recognize when conditions were too risky and patient enough to wait for better opportunities. On March 28, 2002, 42 days after Amanda disappeared, her body was discovered by Forest Service personnel conducting a controlled burn in a remote section of the Umpqua National Forest. The location was over 40 miles from Black Creek, the farthest any victim had been taken, in terrain so rugged and isolated that it was rarely visited even by experienced outdoors enthusiasts. Amanda's body lay in a clearing that followed the now familiar pattern, positioned on her back with arms at sides and legs straight, surrounded by the circular arrangement of branches and stones at cardinal points. The wildflowers near her head had long since withered to dust. She was wearing the same athletic clothes she'd disappeared in, climbing pants and a technical fleece jacket. The medical examiner's findings were consistent with the previous victims: death by asphyxiation through manual strangulation, held alive for a period estimated at 24 to 72 hours before being killed, no evidence of sexual assault. Amanda Chen became the 5th confirmed victim of the Whispering Woods killer. What's particularly chilling about this case is the evolution we're seeing in the killer's behavior. He's becoming bolder, taking greater risks, leaving more obvious signatures. What do you think this tells us about his state of mind? Is he becoming more confident or more desperate? Share your thoughts in the comments below. The discovery of Amanda's body reinvigorated the investigation, but also highlighted how little progress had been made despite years of intensive work. 5 women were dead, 5 families destroyed, and investigators were no closer to identifying the killer than they'd been after the first murder. The forensic examination of Amanda's crime scene was exhaustive, employing every technology available to law enforcement in 2002, but once again yielded nothing useful. No fingerprints, no biological evidence beyond the victim's own, no fibers or trace evidence that could be linked to a suspect. The killer's ability to leave absolutely no forensic evidence was extraordinary and suggested either professional training in evidence avoidance or an obsessive personality that planned every detail meticulously. Some investigators theorized he might wear full protective gear, something like a hazmat suit while handling his victims, though this seemed almost impossibly careful. The psychological profile was updated yet again, incorporating insights from Amanda's case and the long cooling-off period. The profile now suggested a killer who was highly intelligent, possibly even brilliant, with extraordinary self-control and planning abilities. He was comfortable in wilderness settings to an almost superhuman degree, able to navigate rugged terrain, find isolated locations, and operate in conditions that would challenge experienced outdoorsmen. He was physically fit, strong enough to overpower athletic women like Amanda Chen and transport bodies significant distances into remote areas. Most disturbingly, the ritualistic staging of the bodies suggested he was deriving some specific psychological satisfaction from these arrangements, possibly religious or spiritual in nature, though investigators remained cautious about reading too much into the symbolism without more information. The profile emphasized that this was not a disorganized or impulsive killer acting on sudden urges, but rather a methodical predator who planned carefully, selected opportunities strategically, and executed his crimes with chilling efficiency. The community's response to Amanda's murder was different this time, less shock and more resignation, as if people had accepted that this nightmare would never end. There were vigils and memorials, expressions of grief and solidarity, but underneath was a sense of helplessness and despair. How do you protect yourself from a predator this skilled, this patient, this invisible? Women stopped going anywhere alone, even in broad daylight. Outdoor recreation, once a defining feature of life in Black Creek, virtually ceased. The hiking trails and climbing areas stood empty. The economic impact was catastrophic, with businesses dependent on outdoor tourism closing permanently. The population decline accelerated as families who could afford to leave did so, seeking safety and normalcy elsewhere. Those who remained felt trapped, unable to sell property in a market that had collapsed, unable to escape a town that had become synonymous with unsolved serial murder. Sheriff Morrison, now facing intense pressure from county officials and state representatives, made a controversial decision in the summer of 2002. He announced the formation of a special investigative unit focused exclusively on the Whispering Woods killer case, pulling deputies from other duties and requesting additional funding from the county budget. The unit would operate independently of the main task force, pursuing investigative strategies that Morrison felt had been overlooked or underutilized. This decision created tension with Agent Reeves and the FBI contingent, who viewed it as Morrison trying to salvage his reputation by appearing decisive, even if it meant duplicating efforts and creating coordination problems. The split reflected the growing frustration and desperation within law enforcement. Everyone wanted to solve this case, but disagreements about methodology and leadership were hindering rather than helping the effort. As 2002 turned to 2003, the investigation ground forward without major breakthroughs. Then, on June 3, 2003, the killer struck again, claiming his sixth victim. Lisa Browning was a 33-year-old veterinarian who ran a small animal clinic in Black Creek. She'd lived in the area for 5 years, was married to a high school science teacher, and was 7 months pregnant with their first child. Lisa's abduction was particularly shocking because of her pregnancy, and because she was taken in the middle of the afternoon from the parking lot behind her clinic, breaking the pattern of early morning abductions that had characterized most of the previous cases. Lisa had been working late on paperwork, and when she didn't arrive home by 7 that evening, her husband James became immediately alarmed and called the sheriff's department. Her vehicle, a tan Honda Pilot, was found within hours, abandoned on Forest Service Road 9, following the now sickeningly familiar pattern. The fact that the killer had targeted a pregnant woman sent the community's fear to new heights. If he was willing to kill a mother-to-be and her unborn child, then truly no one was safe. The search for Lisa was frantic and desperate, with thousands of volunteers joining professional search teams, many of them driven by the heartbreaking thought that they might be able to save not just Lisa but her baby as well. But on June 22nd, 19 days after her disappearance, Lisa's body was found in a clearing 27 miles from Black Creek. The scene was identical to the previous victims, down to the positioning, the branch circles, the stones, and the wilted wildflowers. The medical examiner confirmed death by manual strangulation, and tragically, the baby had died with her mother. Lisa and her unborn child became the 6th and 7th victims of the Whispering Woods killer, and the community's collective trauma reached depths that seemed impossible to survive. James Browning's grief was profound and public, and his angry statements to the media about law enforcement's failure to catch his wife's killer resonated with a community that had lost faith in the investigation. He filed a lawsuit against the sheriff's department and the county, alleging negligence and failure to protect citizens, a lawsuit that would eventually be settled out of court. But the legal action symbolized a broader loss of trust between the community and the authorities who were supposed to keep them safe. Sheriff Morrison, facing mounting criticism and failing health, announced his retirement in August 2003, effective immediately. He was replaced on an interim basis by his chief deputy, a capable administrator named Sarah Thornton, who inherited what seemed like an impossible situation, an unsolved serial murder case that had stalled, a traumatized community that had lost faith in law enforcement, and a killer who remained as elusive as ever. Then, as suddenly as the killing spree had begun, it stopped. Months passed without another abduction. 2004 came and went with no new victims. 2005, 2006, 2007, nothing. The task force, now operating at minimal capacity with just a handful of dedicated investigators, continued to pursue leads and review evidence. But as years passed without new developments, the case inevitably went cold. The Whispering Woods killer seemed to have vanished, whether through death, imprisonment for other crimes, or simply cessation of his murderous activities, no one could say. The families of the victims lived with the agonizing reality that their loved one's killer would likely never be identified, never face justice, never answer for the lives he'd destroyed. By 2010, the Whispering Woods killer case had become one of those notorious unsolved mysteries that true crime enthusiasts discuss in forums and podcasts, endlessly theorizing about the killer's identity and fate. Black Creek had slowly begun to recover, though the scars remained visible. The population stabilized at around 6,000, significantly lower than the pre-murder era. New families moved in, attracted by affordable housing and stunning natural beauty, often unaware of the town's dark history until after they'd settled. The remaining original residents carried the weight of what had happened, a collective trauma that shaped community identity in ways both obvious and subtle. Memorials to the victims stood in the town square, 7 names carved into stone, a permanent reminder of lives lost and justice denied. The investigation technically remained open, classified as a cold case with periodic reviews but no active investigative work. Sheriff Thornton, who'd been elected to a full term after her interim appointment, maintained the case files meticulously and ensured that any new information, however unlikely that seemed, would be immediately pursued. The physical evidence from all 7 crime scenes remained in secure storage, carefully preserved against the possibility that someday, somehow, advances in forensic technology might extract information that 1990s and early 2000s methods had missed. This foresight would prove crucial when, in 2018, developments in DNA analysis technology finally offered a glimmer of hope. Forensic genealogy had emerged as a revolutionary tool in solving cold cases, most famously in the identification of the Golden State Killer in 2018. The technique involved taking DNA evidence from crime scenes, creating a genetic profile, and then uploading that profile to public genealogy databases to identify relatives of the DNA donor. By building family trees and using traditional investigative methods, law enforcement could potentially narrow down suspects to a specific individual. The technique was controversial, raising privacy concerns and legal questions, but it was also extraordinarily effective. When the Golden State Killer was identified after decades of eluding capture, cold case investigators across the country began reviewing their unsolved cases to see if forensic genealogy might provide answers. In Black Creek, Detective Marcus Webb, a relative newcomer to the sheriff's department who'd become obsessed with the Whispering Woods killer case, saw an opportunity. Webb had joined the department in 2012, well after the murders had ended, but he'd spent countless hours reviewing the case files, familiarizing himself with every detail of the investigation. When he learned about forensic genealogy, he immediately thought of the Whispering Woods case. He knew that the forensic examinations of the crime scenes had been extraordinarily thorough, even if they hadn't yielded usable evidence at the time. He wondered if perhaps something had been collected but couldn't be analyzed with 1990s and early 2000s technology. In early 2018, Webb received permission to have all the physical evidence re-examined using modern forensic techniques. The re-examination took months, with forensic scientists employing technologies that hadn't existed when the evidence was first collected. They used advanced DNA extraction techniques capable of isolating genetic material from increasingly degraded samples. They employed touch DNA analysis, which could potentially detect DNA from skin cells left by brief contact with surfaces. They used new spectrographic analysis methods to identify trace chemicals and compounds. Most of the evidence yielded nothing new. The killer had been too careful. But then, during examination of branches from the circular arrangements found around the victims' bodies, forensic technicians made a breakthrough. On several branches from multiple crime scenes, they detected trace amounts of skin cells, likely deposited when the killer handled the branches to arrange them around his victims. The DNA was degraded and partial, but using modern amplification techniques, they were able to extract enough genetic information to create a profile. The profile was uploaded to public genealogy databases, and the genetic detective work began. Forensic genealogists identified several distant relatives of the DNA donor, people who shared common ancestors but were separated by multiple generations. By painstakingly constructing family trees, tracing descendants of those common ancestors, and cross-referencing with other records, investigators began narrowing down possibilities. The work was tedious and time-consuming, involving birth records, death certificates, census data, marriage licenses, and countless other documents. But slowly, the family trees grew, branches connecting, generations mapped, until a picture began to emerge. By late 2018, investigators had narrowed their focus to a specific family line and ultimately to a specific individual. His name was Thomas Whitaker, and his profile fit the original behavioral assessment almost perfectly. Whitaker had been born in 1962, making him in his 30s and early 40s during the murder spree, exactly the age range the profile had suggested. He'd grown up in Black Creek, had intimate knowledge of the surrounding forests from a lifetime of hunting and hiking. He'd worked as a freelance forestry consultant, a job that gave him flexibility and a legitimate reason to be in remote wilderness areas. He'd never married, lived alone in a house on the outskirts of town. He was intelligent, soft-spoken, and unremarkable, the kind of person who blended into the background and was easily overlooked. And critically, he'd been in Black Creek during the entire period of the murders, from 1998 to 2003. There was just one problem. Thomas Whitaker was dead. He died in a single-vehicle accident in November 2003, just months after Lisa Browning's murder, when his truck left a mountain road and plunged into a ravine. He'd been killed instantly. The accident had been investigated at the time and determined to be just that, an accident, likely caused by speed and poor visibility in heavy rain. No one had connected Whitaker to the murders because he'd never been a suspect. He'd been interviewed once during the initial investigations, along with hundreds of other men who fit the general profile, but nothing in that interview had raised red flags. His answers had been cooperative, his demeanor unremarkable. He'd been cleared and forgotten, just another name in a database of people who'd been checked and eliminated. Now, 15 years after his death, forensic evidence suggested Thomas Whitaker had been the Whispering Woods killer all along. The DNA profile wasn't definitive enough to make a legal determination. The match was strong but not absolute, falling below the threshold typically required for court cases. But combined with his profile fit and his death occurring right when the murders stopped, the circumstantial case was compelling. Investigators exhumed Whitaker's body to obtain a direct DNA sample for comparison. The exhumation was conducted quietly to avoid media attention until results were confirmed, but word inevitably leaked, and suddenly the case was back in national headlines. The direct DNA comparison provided the answer investigators had sought for 20 years. The DNA from Thomas Whitaker's remains was a definitive match to the DNA found on the branches at the crime scenes. Thomas Whitaker was, beyond reasonable scientific doubt, the Whispering Woods killer, the man who'd terrorized Black Creek for 5 years, who'd murdered 7 people including an unborn child, who'd eluded one of the most intensive manhunts in Pacific Northwest history, had been hiding in plain sight the entire time, an unremarkable local man who died in an accident before justice could be served. The revelation was simultaneously satisfying and frustrating for everyone involved. Families of the victims finally had an answer to who had killed their loved ones, closure that had seemed impossible for 2 decades. The community could finally put names to the nightmare, could understand that the monster who'd haunted them had been someone they'd known, someone who'd walked among them undetected. But there would be no trial, no public accounting of Whitaker's crimes, no opportunity for families to confront him or hear him explain why he'd done what he did. He'd escaped earthly justice by dying before he could be identified, and whatever psychological demons had driven him to kill had died with him. The investigation into Whitaker's background revealed chilling details. After his death was confirmed as the killer, investigators obtained warrants to search property Whitaker had owned, including a storage unit no one had known about. Inside that unit, they found what could only be described as a serial killer's trophy collection. There were personal items belonging to all 7 victims, jewelry, clothing, identification cards, photographs. There were notebooks containing detailed observations of women in Black Creek, dozens of potential victims Whitaker had stalked but never abducted. There were maps of the forests with locations marked, including the clearings where bodies had been found, and several others that had never been used. Most disturbing were journals in which Whitaker had documented his thoughts and feelings about the murders, written in a cold, clinical style that revealed a deeply disturbed mind with absolutely no empathy for his victims. He'd viewed them as objects, as necessary components in rituals he believed gave his life meaning and purpose. Psychological experts who reviewed Whitaker's writings diagnosed him as a classic organized serial killer with probable narcissistic and antisocial personality disorders. His journals revealed that he'd been fantasizing about killing since his teenage years, but had maintained control until his mid-30s, when a series of personal stressors, including his mother's death and the failure of a long-term relationship, had apparently triggered the onset of his killing spree. The ritualistic staging of the victims was indeed significant to him, representing what he viewed as a return to nature, placing the women in forest clearings as offerings to some vague concept of natural forces he believed governed existence. It was delusional thinking born of deep psychological disturbance, but it had given structure and meaning to his crimes in his twisted worldview. The discovery of Whitaker's journals also revealed something that investigators had long suspected, that the 7 confirmed victims were likely not his only crimes. Whitaker had written about earlier experiments, references to incidents in the late 1980s and early 1990s that he described in vague terms, but that strongly suggested he'd been responsible for other disappearances or unsolved murders. Law enforcement agencies across the Pacific Northwest began reviewing cold cases from that period, looking for crimes that might match Whitaker's methods and timeline. Several promising leads emerged, including 2 unsolved murders in Northern California from the early 1990s that bore striking similarities to the Black Creek cases. DNA evidence from those scenes was compared to Whitaker's profile, and in both cases, matches were confirmed. Thomas Whitaker's victim count rose from 7 to at least 9, and possibly more that would never be definitively proven. Sheriff Thornton held a press conference in January 2019 to announce the resolution of the Whispering Woods killer case. Standing alongside families of the victims, FBI representatives, including a now-retired agent Catherine Reeves and Detective Marcus Webb, whose persistence had led to the breakthrough, Thornton explained how forensic genealogy had finally identified the killer after 20 years. She acknowledged the investigation's failures and missteps, particularly the months wasted pursuing Richard Kohler while Whitaker continued killing. She expressed profound sorrow that justice in the form of prosecution would never be achieved, but emphasized that at least the mystery was solved, the families had answers, and the community could finally close this dark chapter of its history. The press conference was emotional, with several family members speaking about their loved ones and thanking investigators for never giving up, even when the case seemed hopeless. The resolution of the case sparked renewed discussion about cold case investigations, forensic genealogy, and the importance of preserving evidence even when cases seem unsolvable. The Whispering Woods killer case became a teaching example in law enforcement training, illustrating both the challenges of hunting serial killers and the potential for new technologies to solve even the coldest cases. It also raised uncomfortable questions about how Whitaker had been overlooked during the original investigation. Had there been mistakes that allowed him to avoid scrutiny? Could the later victims have been saved if investigators had been more thorough? These questions would never have satisfying answers, but they highlighted the importance of careful, methodical investigative work and the dangers of tunnel vision that can lead investigators to focus on the wrong suspects. Black Creek today is a different place than it was before the murders, but it's healing. The population has stabilized and even grown slightly as new generations move in, attracted by natural beauty and small-town life, generally aware of the town's history but not defined by it. The memorials to the 7 victims remain, but they're no longer the dominant feature of community identity. Parents who lived through the terror raise their children with perhaps a bit more caution than they might otherwise, but life has returned to something resembling normalcy. The forests that were once hunting grounds for a predator are once again places of recreation and beauty, though those old enough to remember still feel a chill when they pass the old logging roads where vehicles were found. The families of the victims have found various ways to cope with their losses and the knowledge of who killed their loved ones. Some found closure in finally knowing the truth, while others struggle with the fact that Whitaker never faced trial or punishment. Sarah Jenkins's parents, Thomas and Margaret, established a foundation in their daughter's name that provides scholarships for young women studying environmental science, ensuring that Sarah's passion lives on and helps others. Rebecca Martinez's daughters, now adults with families of their own, remember their mother through stories and photographs, keeping her memory alive for their children. Each family has navigated grief in their own way, but all expressed some degree of relief when the case was finally solved. even if imperfectly. As we close this chapter on one of the Pacific Northwest's most disturbing unsolved cases, now solved through persistence and technology, we're left with questions that may never be fully answered. What created the monster that was Thomas Whitaker? What childhood experiences or genetic predispositions led him down the path to becoming a serial killer? How many other victims might there have been that we'll never know about? And perhaps most importantly, how many other cold cases are waiting to be solved with new technologies and renewed dedication? The story of the Whispering Woods Killer is ultimately about more than just one man's crimes. It's about the resilience of communities in the face of terror, the dedication of investigators who never gave up even when cases seemed hopeless, the advancement of forensic science that can now solve crimes that would have remained forever unsolved just a generation ago, and the families who endure unimaginable loss but somehow find the strength to continue living and honoring their loved ones' memories. It's a reminder that evil exists in the world, sometimes hiding in plain sight, but that justice, even delayed, can still prevail. The Whispering Woods Killer case stands as one of the most complex and disturbing serial murder investigations in modern American history. 7 lives taken, 7 families destroyed, a community traumatized for generations, and a killer who escaped justice by dying before he could be identified. But through persistence, technological advancement, and the dedication of investigators like Detective Marcus Webb, who refused to let the case fade into obscurity, the truth finally emerged. Thomas Whitaker's name is now recorded in the annals of serial killer history, and the victims' families finally have the answers they'd sought for over 20 years. If you found this deep dive into the Whispering Woods Killer case as fascinating and disturbing as I did researching it, please give this video a thumbs up and share it with anyone interested in true crime mysteries. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, because we'll be covering more unsolved cases and criminal investigations in future videos. Leave a comment below with your thoughts on this case. Do you think there are more victims we don't know about? What do you think drove Thomas Whitaker to commit these horrific crimes? And what other cases would you like us to cover? Your engagement helps this channel grow and allows us to continue bringing you these in-depth investigations into the darkest corners of human behavior. Remember the victims: Sarah Jenkins, Rebecca Martinez, Jennifer Hartley, Michelle Porter, Amanda Chen, Lisa Browning, and her unborn child. They were daughters, mothers, friends, professionals, and valued members of their community. They deserve justice, and while it came later and less completely than anyone would have wished, at least their families finally have answers. Their stories remind us to remain vigilant, to look out for one another, and to never give up seeking truth and justice, no matter how long it takes. Until next time, stay safe, look out for each other, and remember that even the coldest cases can eventually be solved. This has been the story of the Whispering Woods Killer, Oregon's unsolved nightmare that finally found resolution through science, persistence, and an unwavering commitment to justice. Thank you for watching.